So folks, our topic for today is to combine some of the last few topics that we've been discussing. We've been discussing ceilings and floors, and we've been talking about consumer and producer surplus. What we're going to do today is merge the two together. We want to know what happens to consumer and producer surplus when we impose ceilings or floors. So we're going to do the case of ceilings in class today, and then you'll have the opportunity to look at a floor on your own. We're going to start by reviewing both ceilings and floors and consumer and producer surplus. You're going to want to take detailed notes, and I've asked you to bring colored pens to class. You're definitely going to need them. If you're coming in late, you need to get a copy of the handout. So let's quickly start with this problem. So quickly sketch this out into your notes, write out this schedule. But hopefully you see that what I've given you here is a demand and supply schedule, right? It's a demand curve because I've given you price and I've given you quantity demanded, and the quantity demanded across price gives me demand. And I've given you quantity supplied across price. So that's our supply curve. So this is nothing more than supply and demand, but we're looking at it in chart form. So very quickly write out this example, and we're going to start with this. So take another second, quickly write this out. And the first thing that I'm likely to expect you to know, I may not ask you specifically, but you have to know before you do ceilings and floors, is what is the equilibrium price and quantity exchanged in the market here? So can we look at this and determine equilibrium price, everybody? What is equilibrium price here? $90. Now, why do I need to know equilibrium price? Well, I need to know, it's going to help me know if a ceiling or floor is binding or non-binding, right? So without knowing the equilibrium price, then I can't really know what I'm doing with ceilings and floors. So does everyone agree that the equilibrium price is going to be 90? We've got quantity demanded of 260. We've got quantity supplied of 260. Do we have a surplus or a shortage here, guys? No. So I know that 90 is the equilibrium price because it creates no surplus and no shortage. So finding this is pretty easy. Now, guys, everyone understand why I need to know equilibrium price? Because how do I know if a ceiling has been placed above or below equilibrium price and therefore is binding or non-binding without knowing what the equilibrium price is? But I want to be very clear. On a test, I might not ask you this question first. I might expect you to be able to determine equilibrium without me having to prod you to do so. So let's move on and do another question. So let's say we have a price floor. Oops, sorry. I have a price floor at $110. And you're going to first determine is this binding or non-binding, and then you're going to determine the effect. Now, it's a lot easier when we remember that $90 is our equilibrium market price. So guys, is this a binding or non-binding floor? Binding or non-binding?
If it's a price floor,
is it binding or non-binding? Everybody, binding or non-binding? It's going to be binding. I'm putting a price floor right here. And what do we know? Where do price floors go? They go above the equilibrium price if we want them to be effective or to be binding, okay? So quantity demanded of this price floor is going to be what? 220, good. And quantity supplied is going to be what? 320. So what have I created here with this price floor? A surplus. Good. How much? How many units is a surplus? 100 units. Good. Now, do you see that I need to know the equilibrium price before I can say that this floor is indeed binding, right? All right. Let's do another one. Yeah. So remember, binding or non-binding, binding means it influences the market. Binding means it will have an effect, cause an inefficiency. If it's non-binding, then it means that it has no effect, right? So we'll do one of those two. All right. What if we instead impose a ceiling at 80? So everyone imposes ceiling at 80. What's the effect? Is this binding or non-binding? Ceiling of 80. Binding or non-binding, everybody? Everyone agree it's binding. Well, how do we know? It is below the equilibrium price. So remember, ceilings are below equilibrium price if they are binding. So we covered that really carefully in the last class lecture that we had on ceilings and floors. So what is the effect? Quantity demanded from the ceiling is going to be what? What's quantity demanded going to be, everybody? 280, good. What's quantity supplied going to be? 230. So what have we created here? A shortage. And how many units is that shortage? 50 units. Good. So we agree that I have to have the equilibrium price to be able to determine that that ceiling is indeed binding, right? Let's do one more. What if instead we impose a price ceiling at $100? So we're going to impose a ceiling at $100. Is that binding? Is that binding? Some of you are saying yes. But here's our equilibrium price. All right? So let's remember, demand and supply. We have an equilibrium price of 90. And so the ceiling, we're putting it in at 100. What do we remember about a ceiling? A ceiling is a price you cannot go what? Well, think about in a room. Cannot go above, right? You cannot go above the ceiling. So this ceiling of $100 rules out all these prices right there. Is that where the market wants to go? No, where does the market want to go? To the equilibrium, exactly. So is there any reason we can't see this market responding by adjusting to the equilibrium? Have we ruled out the equilibrium price? No. So the market's going to adjust to a price of $90. And at $90, what's quantity demanded? 260. And what's quantity supplied? 260. Is there a surplus? Is there a shortage? No. No surplus and no shortage. So let me ask the question again. Is this binding or non-binding? What's the answer? It is non-binding. In other words, ineffective. Has no impact on the market, right? There was a hand up a second ago? Yeah. Uh-huh. Right. So again, I'm not saying that it would make sense for us to put a ceiling at 100. This is basically to test your knowledge. So basically I'm saying, what if you get it backwards and you accidentally put the ceiling at 100? You need to understand that if you accidentally put the ceiling at the top, which kind of makes sense, right? Because in a room, a ceiling's at the top and a floor's at the bottom. If you do that, it's kind of nonsensical because it has no effect. That's what I'm trying to illustrate. So where do ceilings need to go? At prices below equilibrium, right? Exactly. You with me? Everybody with me? Okay. So you need to be able to look at numbers like this and understand if something is binding or non-binding. You need to be able to talk about, will there be a surplus or will there be a shortage? All right. Let's review the idea of consumer surplus really quickly. And you've already taken a look at this as well, but let's quickly review. Let's start with the definition. So remember, get in your notes that the definition of consumer surplus is the difference between what consumers are willing to pay and what they're asked to pay. So the difference between what a consumer is willing to pay and what a consumer is asked to pay. The difference between what a consumer is willing to pay and what a consumer is asked to pay. So a quick numerical example to illustrate. Let's say you're willing to pay $10 for a movie ticket. That's your willingness to pay, right? You go to the movies expecting to pay $10. You're willing and able to pay $10. So you get there and the price turns out to be $8. That's what you're asked to pay, right? My willingness to pay in this example is $10, but what the person's asked to pay is $8. Does this person get consumer surplus? Yeah. How much? $2, right? $2 of consumer surplus. Everybody with me? That makes sense. But we need to be able to take a look at this graphically. So I'm not going to be asking you questions like this on test 2 because we've moved on to look at this graphically. So you need to make sure you understand it graphically. All right? So this is very simple. It ties into the idea of marginal benefit, marginal cost. So let's illustrate using just a single individual. Now, for me to do a single individual, I need to use marginal cost, marginal benefit. If I'm looking at a market, then that's supply and demand. But just for one person, let's look at marginal benefit, marginal cost. So follow along with me on this graph. Get this into your notes. So draw your axes. And now, for us to illustrate this, we need to add to it a marginal benefit curve. So we normally think of people as having diminishing marginal benefit. In other words, my willingness to pay, my marginal willingness to pay falls as I consume more. I'm willing to pay $10 for the first unit, but maybe only $9.50 for a second unit, and maybe $9 for the third unit. Okay? So let's say that this person is asked to pay $8. So does everyone agree their willingness to pay comes from what? The marginal benefit curve, right? But what they're asked to pay comes from what? The price they're charged. Everybody with me? So we're just doing the same thing, but we're looking at it graphically. So for this individual, they're asked to pay $8. So they show up, hey, price is $8, but I was willing to pay this amount reflected in my marginal benefit curve. And for the next unit, we're being asked to pay $8, but we still have a marginal benefit that is higher. So if I look at each incremental unit, does this person get consumer surplus right here? He does, all the way until we get to this point right here. Do we agree at that marginal point where I've drawn my arrow, his marginal benefit is 8 and his price is 8. So what's his consumer surplus for that marginal unit? Yeah, so his consumer surplus for that marginal incremental unit is 0. Is it rational to consume something that has 0 consumer surplus, folks? Is it rational? Sure, it's rational to consume. So we're basically just looking at the difference between what somebody's willing to pay and what they're asked to pay. And at some point, there's going to be a break-even point where I'm willing to pay 10. You ask me to pay 10. I break even. It's still rational for me. So now what we want to do is take this, since we understand this, and apply it to the marketplace. Now, for us to look at the market, we need supply and demand. But there are 2 important pieces of information that you need to understand And please make sure you get these in your notes because this will make it a lot easier. First, demand is the sum of the marginal benefits. So that's the first thing we need to remember, that a demand curve is the sum of the marginal benefits. A demand curve is nothing more than the sum of the marginal benefits. A demand curve is simply the sum of the marginal benefits. The second thing you need to remember, and you need to get in your notes, is that supply reflects marginal cost. Supply reflects marginal costs. So when we work with supply and demand, it's helpful to remember that a demand curve is marginal benefits and a supply curve is marginal cost. All right? So draw yourself a graph, and we need our downward sloping demand curve. And we need our upward sloping supply curve. And I'm going to write in here the things that we just learned. We learned that our demand curve is simply the sum of marginal benefits, people's marginal willingness to pay. And the supply curve captures marginal cost. So if we remember those, it becomes very easy to think about producer and consumer surplus. All right? So let's add in a price, PE, equilibrium price. So guys, now we can look at consumer surplus. We know that it's going to be the difference between willingness to pay and price. So do we agree it's going to be that yellow area? And so use your colors. All right. Question? So we've just found consumer surplus. Because that's the difference between what people are asked to pay, which is price PE, and what they're willing to pay, which comes from the demand curve. All right? So if we understand this, guys, then we can understand producer surplus. Everyone with me on consumer surplus? All right, well, let's move on to talk about producer surplus. Producer surplus is a little less intuitive for people because we're not used to thinking like producers. We are thinking like consumers most of the time. So let's start with a definition. Producer surplus is going to be the difference between what a producer is willing to accept, the difference between what a producer is willing to accept, and we mean accept as payment, and what he's actually paid. So the difference between what I'm willing to accept and what I'm paid, that's my producer surplus. So the difference between my willingness to accept and what I'm actually paid. Now, we need to understand that our willingness to accept is tied to cost. My willingness to accept is tied to cost. And think about why. I must cover my marginal cost, right? That makes sense to everyone, right? So my willingness to accept is tied to cost. Because if I don't cover my own marginal cost, then everyone agree that's irrational, right? So we want to remember that a producer has to cover his marginal cost. If he doesn't cover his own marginal cost, then he loses money, right? So for example, guys, am I going to sell you something for $12 that cost me $15 to produce? Am I going to do that? No, that would be irrational. So our willingness to accept clearly is connected to our marginal cost. So let's say that a producer has a marginal cost of $7. Does everyone agree? He has to get at least $7, right? Or he's going to make a loss. So my marginal cost $7. I have to have at least $7 from you, or I cannot sell this to you because I will make a loss. But let's say we get a market price of $8. I've covered my marginal cost, right? Covered my marginal cost. Have we made producer surplus here? We have. How much? $1. Good. So he has $1 in producer surplus. So consumer surplus and producer surplus are different. Producers are thinking about covering their marginal cost. And if I get anything above marginal cost, that's gravy, right? That's going to be bonus. All right. So let's do the same thing, and let's graph this for an individual. And again,
Would that dollar be considered profit?
So yeah, it would be, in a sense, profit's thought of a little differently, because profit, when we start graphing profit, it's going to be related to our, average cost. We're going to calculate total revenues, and we're going to calculate our total cost, and the difference is profit. But you're exactly right. If I have a marginal cost of 7 and I sell it for 6, I have just reduced my profit. You're exactly right. Okay? So let's now do the same kind of analysis. We need a upward sloping marginal cost curve. So for us to talk about producer surplus, we need to be looking at marginal cost. So let's put in our marginal cost curve. And let's put in a price of $8. So $8 is the price they're going to get. $8 is the price that consumers are going to pay. All right, you with me? So if $8 are the price that consumers are going to pay, then of course we need to compare what the consumers are paying, $8, and what it's costing the producer, his marginal cost, right? Everyone agree on that first unit? We've just measured the producer surplus with that green vertical distance, right? And for the next unit, consumers are paying $8, and I'm still more than covering my marginal cost. Third unit, people are paying $8, and I'm still more than covering my marginal cost. So I'm getting producer surplus on all of these units. What about this marginal unit right here? What's happening here? Do we agree that the marginal cost is exactly equal to $8? So you're paying $8. My cost is $8. Is there any producer surplus here? No. So producer surplus equals 0. But do we agree it's still rational? If you want to sell me something for $8 that cost you $8 marginally to produce, that is rational. You're not going to pocket any money, as somebody just pointed out, but it's not irrational. All right? So from this, we can now extrapolate to the entire market. So if you understand this, you understand what we're going to do next, which is look at the entire market. So again, for the entire market, we need supply and demand. So let's expand this to the market. Yeah. So let me go back this way. So I asked you for this marginal unit, this one right here, where his marginal cost is 8, but he's being paid 8. Do you agree with me? He gets 0 consumer surplus, 0 producer surplus? Yeah. And is that rational?
It is. I was
it is rational. It's not irrational. Right. Exactly. Now, chances are I'm going to ask you for more than $8 at this point, but it's not irrational. I'm not losing anything. I'm just not gaining anything. Does that make sense? All right. So let's now expand to the market. So to expand to the market, we need our demand curve. So everyone draw a demand curve. And we need a supply curve. And I want you to remember, guys, that supply curve captures marginal cost, right? That is going to help us. If we remember that supply curves capture marginal cost. So now let's label our equilibrium price. So do we agree people are going to pay price PE here, right? Whatever dollar value it is, price PE, right? So we can now look at producer surplus. People in the market are paying PE, but the marginal cost of producing this is far lower than price PE. So there's producer surplus. And we continue to get producer surplus all the way to this equilibrium point. So when we look at smaller incremental units, do we agree that we're going to get back this triangle right here? So we have just found producer surplus in the market. All right, so far so good? You with me? All right. At this point, guys, we haven't imposed any ceilings or any floors. So what we're going to do next is use the handout that I gave you. And if you're watching this online or if you want to go back and practice, I'll post a clean handout under this lecture for you in Canvas. But now what we're going to do is look at the effect of a ceiling. Now, we're going to do a before and after. So notice right here, this says before the ceiling. Now, before the ceiling, do you agree before the ceiling, we would be operating at that equilibrium, right? And we know what's going to happen. So I want you to answer these 4 questions. We just covered this content, so everyone should be able to do this. So I want you to get out your colored pens that I asked you to bring and answer these 4 questions on your handout on the left side. Please make sure that you're on the side that says ceiling and not floor. Okay? Ceiling. Make sure you're on the side that says ceiling. So take a moment and answer these questions. Yeah.
Do you have an extra?
I do. They're right over here. You can just come grab one right here. If you did not get a handout, guys, they're right here in this front row. All right, so I want everybody working. I want everybody working. And guys, for ease, I'm going to label these areas 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. But I want you shading them in. So you might want to label the same thing, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 on the left side of your graph. I want to see everyone working, guys. Some of you are sleeping. Some of you are on your phones. You need to pay attention to this. This is confusing content. So I want everyone to focus. All right, so guys, what price are we going to see in the market here? What price are we going to see? If there's no ceiling and no floor, everybody, what price are we going to see? P star, right? The equilibrium price is P star. And in my last section, they got confused because they said there's no price listed. There is a price. P star is a price. It's just not listed in dollars, right? And so you got to get used to this. I might not always give you dollars. I might make it P0, P1, okay? P hat, P bar, P star. So everyone agree, before we impose a ceiling, the price is P star. How many units are going to be exchanged? Q star units. Exactly, Q star units. So based on that, you should be able to determine consumer surplus and producer surplus. So consumer surplus Does everyone agree consumer surplus is going to be difference between the demand curve, which captures people's willingness to pay, and what they actually have to pay? Everyone agree with that right there? Does everyone have consumer surplus? So my graph has consumer surplus in yellow, and it's areas 1 plus 2 plus 3. Everyone agree with that? Areas 1, 2, 3? Oh, 5, sorry. Thank you. 1, 2, 5. My bad, sorry. 1, 2, 5. That's better. 1, 2, 5. Everyone agree with that? 1, 2, 5? All right. And did everyone find producer surplus? So producer surplus is going to be the difference between, remember, the supply curve, which captures marginal cost, and what price people are actually paying. So my area is in green. Does everyone agree that it's going to be that green triangle right there? So for me, it's going to be green, and it's areas 3 plus 4 plus 5. No, 6. Gosh, what is wrong with me? 6. 3 plus 4 plus 6. All right, so far so good? So finding consumer surplus is really easy when the market is left alone, right? We're not imposing any ceilings or floors at this point. But we want to look at a before and an after. So this is the before the ceiling. On the right side of your handout, it's asking us what happens after. So let's look at those questions. And again, we're just answering those 4 first questions, okay? So now we've imposed a ceiling. So notice it says after the ceiling's imposed. So my ceiling's in red. And do we agree that ceiling is imposed at a price P ceiling? Okay. Now guys, be very clear that on a test, I'm probably not giving you this kind of stuff, telling you that there's a shortage and that kind of stuff. You're going to need to be able to figure stuff out yourself. So this is where it gets a little confusing. Once we impose the ceiling, what is our new price going to be? What do I have it labeled as? P ceiling, right? Everyone agree our new price after we impose the ceiling is going to be price P ceiling. So do we agree that price has fallen from P star to P ceiling? Everyone agree? It was P star when the market was left alone, but remember the point of ceilings. Ceilings are used to lower prices to consumers, right? So we've lowered the price to consumers. Hopefully you're remembering, hey, ceilings are used to help consumers. And that's kind of what this is doing, right? It's lowering the price. But the next question can be a little confusing. So let's put a star by that one. Let's put a star by that one. The question says, how many units will be exchanged? How many units will be exchanged? Now, let's put some numbers in to help us think through this, okay? So I'm saying quantity supplied is 100. Quantity demanded is 250. Now, I'm not likely to give you those kinds of numbers either on a test, but I'm using them to illustrate. So I want to know how many units are going to be exchanged, right? And by exchange, that means I'm buying, you're selling. We are transacting over a unit. How many units do people want? How many units do people want, people? Everybody. 250 units. That's quantity demanded, right? How many are available? How many are available? 100. So how many are going to be transacted over? How many are going to be exchanged? 100, right? Even though people want 250, only 100 are going to be exchanged. Everyone with me? There's only 100 available. So that's kind of the confusing part. We have to figure out how many units are going to be exchanged? How many units are going to be transacted over? So once we determine that, nothing on this graph to the right matters. Those aren't any units that are transacted. Okay, so now we want to find consumer surplus and producer surplus. I contend we should start with producer surplus. It's a little bit easier. Remember, producer surplus is the difference between what price you're going to get and what price your producer's going to get. What price are they getting? What price are producers getting? What are producers going to be paid when they sell a unit? Y'all are looking at me. It's not a trick question, guys. Read it off the graph. P ceiling, right? P ceiling. They're going to be paid the price ceiling price. P ceiling. Guys, get off your phone. P ceiling. Where do I go to find their marginal costs? From the supply curve, right? Remember, the supply curve is marginal cost. You with me? So do we agree that the difference between the price they get, price P ceiling, and the supply curve, their marginal cost, is going to be their producer surplus? Everyone agree? You with me? So green area is producer surplus. Take a look. What's happened to it? It did what? Everybody? It shrunk a little. Does that make intuitive sense? This is a price ceiling, which helps consumers, which hurts producers, right? And producer surplus has shrunk. Good. All right. Now we want to find consumer surplus. But let me put in here for me on my graph, what area represents producer surplus? Let's come back here and label the same labels. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So it's area 4. Everyone agree? Area 4. Now let's look at consumer surplus. Sorry. Now, consumer surplus, use another color, is going to be the difference between what consumers have to pay, the price they have to pay. What is the price they have to pay? The ceiling price, and what they're willing to pay. Where do I go to get what they're willing to pay? The demand curve, right? Remember, the demand curve is the sum of the marginal benefits. So I need to find the difference between what they're being asked to pay, which is the ceiling price, and what they're willing to pay, which comes from their demand curve, right? So consumer surplus is going to capture all of this. Now, guys, is it going to go past 100 units? Is consumer surplus going past 100 units? Should it be picking up areas like 5 or 6? Why not? Why not? They keep expanding. Because we are limited by the amount supplied. And the amount supplied is 100 units here, right? We want 250 units, but only 100 is being supplied. So do we agree that this yellow area on my graph is consumer surplus? So what area is consumer surplus? For me, it's the yellow area. And that is 1 plus 2 plus 3. Everyone agree with that? 1 plus 2 plus 3? Okay. So now we want to compare. Somebody's better off and somebody's worse off, right? So let's answer the questions below on your handout. The first question says, there's been a transfer of surplus. Or has there been a transfer of surplus? Do we see a transfer of surplus? In other words, It belonged to somebody, but now it belongs to somebody else. Who's losing here? Ah, so we see producers are losing. What areas are they losing? What areas are producers losing? Michael, what areas are producers losing? Either one of you. I was actually asking the one that was asleep. But you can answer. What area are producers losing?
3 to 6.
Okay. Do we agree with that? Let's take a look. This is before, and this is after. So before and after. Do we agree with Michael? They've lost areas 3 and 6. Do we agree with that? So if you're not seeing that, look at before, look at 3 and 6. And now they're not green anymore. What was that? Well, I'm asking about producers. 5 never belonged to producers. Now you're right, I need to address 5, but I asked what producers are losing. Remember, producer surplus is green, right? So take a look. Producers have 3, 4, 6, right? And now, after the ceiling, they only have 4. So what did they lose? Producers. They lost 3 and 6. Do we agree with that? Everyone agree? So producers are losing areas 3 and 6, right? So let's make sure we understand before the ceiling. So before the ceiling, what areas did producers have? Producer surplus before was what? Guys, come on. Before the surplus, producers had what?
1, 2,
Producers did not have 1. They had 3, 4, and 6, right? Guys, if you haven't written these numbers down on your graphs, you're not going to be able to follow this, okay? So do we agree before they had 3, 4, and 6? Everyone agree? After the ceiling, they have 4, right? So before the ceiling, they had 3 plus 4 plus 6. After the ceiling, producer surplus is only 4. So they've lost 3 and 6, right? So where did 3 go? Where did 3 go? Let's take a look. Let's look at 3. This is before the ceiling. Look at area 3. This is after the ceiling. What happened to it? It went from green to yellow. So who does it belong to now? Consumers. So it was transferred to consumers, right? And what happens to 6? What happened to 6? It was producers, and now it's nobody's, right? So it just goes away, disappears. Let's do the same thing for consumers. Before the ceiling, consumer surplus is equal to what? Before the ceiling, consumer surplus is 1, 2, 5, right? After it's what? 1, 2, 3. So before it was 1 plus 2 plus 5. But after the ceiling, it was what? 1, 2, and 3. Did anything from consumers go to producers? Did anything that belongs to consumers go to the producers? No. So producers are losing, and it's being transferred to consumers. Everyone agree with that? So the ceiling has done what? It has made consumers better off at the expense of who? Producers, right? This is something that benefits consumers, and it hurt producers, right? So the next question asks, has any surplus simply disappeared? So let's take a look. Here's before the ceiling. Here's after the ceiling. Before, after. Anything just disappear? Yeah. 5 and 6, right? 5 plus 6 simply disappear. Where did 5 come from? Guys, where did 5 come from? It came from who? Consumers. Where did 6 come from? Ah, producers. Good. So 5 came from consumers, and 6 came from producers. So we have this whole area that looks like this, that just disappears. The last question here says, what do we call this area of surplus that has just disappeared? We call that the dead weight loss. The dead weight loss. And the dead weight loss is kind of like saying the pie has shrunk. When we look at the benefits collectively, the ceiling made the benefits shrink. Now, make sure we understand this. So the last two questions, number one is, what is the dead weight loss? So we just said that the dead weight loss, get this in your notes somewhere on your handout, what is the dead weight loss? It's going to be lost consumer surplus plus lost producer surplus, and it simply disappears. And the reason it disappears is that the ceiling led to fewer units exchanged. The ceiling led to fewer units being exchanged. Remember, in this example, there were only 100 units exchanged. Now, the problem here is that there are units that are above 100 where marginal benefits are greater than marginal cost. So there are some units where marginal benefits are greater than marginal cost, which means it would be rational to exchange these units too. But they're not going to be exchanged because the ceiling doesn't give anyone an incentive, right? Quantity supplied has gone way down because producers are getting a low price. Does that make sense? So this is an inefficiency. It shrinks the pie. And when the pie shrinks, that's never a good thing. We want to maximize the pie. So, last 30 seconds, guys. What's the case against price controls? Well, we don't like them because they create inefficiency. You guys need to get this into your notes. They create inefficiencies, they shrink the pie. And that's never a good thing. But do we care specifically about the transfer? In this case, producers were made better off. Worse off. Consumers were made better off, right? We transferred surplus from one to the other. And we need to note that the economists don't care about this all that much. As long as somebody gets the surplus, we're not so concerned, but we are concerned about inefficiencies. And the price controls create inefficiencies. And that's why economists generally are not supportive of that kind of strategy.